welcome and thanks for coming to the Festival of Urbanism, Resilience and Recovery, Urbanism in the Time of Disaster. I'm Professor Carl Grodock. I'm Director of Urban Planning and Design at Monash, and I'm also co-director of the Festival of Urbanism. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land, which I'm speaking to you today on. I also would like to recognize traditional owners and elders from other lands, from people joining us online. This is our 9th Festival of Urbanism and the 5th that we've held in Melbourne. And so the event today is really wrapping up the Melbourne leg. And then we're jumping over to Sydney next week. So tomorrow we have a walking tour of Smart City Footscray. And that's sponsored by our Monash Planning Student Association. And then from there, we go to Sydney for a week, and all of that's online as well, so you can go have a look at those events and join online too. And just before I hand the mic over to Catherine, I just want to say a huge thanks to everyone that has helped to organize this event over the last week. So Nicholas Gueratao, Thomas Vowles, I think, Maddie, whose last name I can't remember, Norman Muiko and Hope Elston, Aaron Middleton. So a really great team at Monash that has helped to make this all happen. So thanks very much. Hope you enjoy the event tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carl. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of which we're meeting on today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And it's a particularly exciting moment for me today in that this local council area, formerly known as the City of Moreland, is now going to be known as the City of Merribeck, which means stony country in the Woiwurrung language. So I think that's incredible that that connection has been acknowledged, and I think a far more meaningful and appropriate name than the former name, which related to a Jamaican slave estate. So I'm Catherine Sunderman, Vice President of Urban Design Forum. And Urban Design Forum is a non-profit organisation that supports the public interest outcomes in the cities that we shape. I'm also an architect and urban designer at MGS Architects. So as Carl mentioned, today is part of the Festival of Future Urbanism. So this is really a chance to think about the future of our cities and how we can best guide this future. So thinking of the future, I was recently helping run and curate a workshop as part of a university master plan. And we were asking the kind of standard question in that environment of what will this campus be like in 2040? And so we had all the usual responses of people saying, well, it's going to be this amazing digitally enabled campus and, you know, this kind of really hybrid environment where we'll have all these augmented experiences, etc. So all sounding very kind of amazing and Jetsons-like in the excitement about the future. But there was one comment that really stood out to me, and that was one of the participants said, well, actually, this campus is going to need to be a refuge. Like, we're going to experience increasing frequency of extreme events, and we need to think about the role that this campus will play in supporting that. And this isn't a crazy, far-flung idea. Actually, the University of the Southern Cross University up in Lismore is actually using their campus for the next 6 months to aid with the recovery process that's happening there following the floods, the multiple floods that they've had in the Northern Rivers area. So I found that idea really striking, and it made me start to think, what physical and community infrastructure are we going to need in Melbourne and other cities similar to Melbourne to really help us respond and prepare for these more increasing frequency of events. So today in this panel, as part of the Festival of Future Urbanism, we're going to find out. So in order to help us answer this question, we've brought together a really exciting panel of people that have quite a diversity of different experiences. I don't normally read out biographies, but today I actually think it's really helpful to help frame the background of each of these panellists. So firstly, Alyssa McMillan is the City Resilience Strategy Lead at the City of Melbourne. Through human-centred design, she creates solutions to urban challenges through creative problem solving, experimentation, and community-led approaches. She's currently leading the city's major initiative on community disaster resilience, which hopefully we'll hear more about today. Next up, we have Dr. Jen Ray, who is an award-winning artist and researcher. I'm very excited to meet her today. Her practice is centred around cultural responses to climate change / emergency, aka everything change, specifically the role of artists. Her practice is engaged in discourses around disaster resilience, speculative futures, and food justice, predominantly articulated through the multi-platform collaborative projects such as the Precedent Refuge Project at Arts House and the Centre for Rewilding. So I hope again that we can hear more about refuge as we go on today. Our next panellist is Faye Bendricks, a volunteer SES emergency frontline responder, leader and advocate. So during the last 17 years, she has volunteered for the Victorian SES. She's served in multiple leadership roles, dedicated thousands of hours to strengthen local communities and developed local, national and international networks to support SES volunteers. Excitingly and kind of in response to this incredible volunteering work, in 2020 she was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia in the Australia Day Awards in response to this work. Finally, Andrew Boyd Barber is an urban designer and strategic planner who has worked on a number of major urban regeneration projects in Australia, the United Kingdom and New Zealand. Andrew worked as an urban designer for the Christchurch City Council during a period of post-quake recovery, providing expert urban design advice during this period and assisting with the running of the council's independent design review panel. So someone who's been there for the post-disaster recovery and will hopefully enlighten us more on what that process has been like in Christchurch. So now onto the conversation. We'll be following a series of facilitated questions initially for about the next 40 minutes before opening up to Q&A. So as we're going through the conversation, please think about what questions you have for the panel and we'll be ready to answer them. So the first one, I think, brings us back to that question of what is Melbourne going to be like in 2040? So I'll ask each of the panellists, from your perspective, what kinds of extreme events and disasters might we be facing? Who will they affect and how will they affect us? I wonder if, Lisa, you'd like to begin.
Hello, great. I think by 2040, and it's not that far away, we know that we're going to be experiencing increasing disasters, more complexity of disasters, and different intersections of the types of stresses that we already see in our city. So while there are many that we already know about, things like heat waves and floods, particularly in Melbourne, are probably two of the big ones to consider. Disasters don't happen in silos. I think we've seen this through the pandemic, that it's possible that you can have multiple disasters at once. And what happens when these things start to intersect? So in a pandemic, in a lockdown, we might have a heat wave. You might live in poor quality housing. Not everyone has really great housing to live in. What does that mean? And by 2040, I think we're going to see this confluence of different disasters and different vulnerabilities come through in more complex ways. So yeah, things that we need to consider and be prepared for.
I agree with everything Alyssa said, but just thinking about the flow-on effects that affect other systems, like we saw in the pandemic around food systems, right? That certain communities are food deserts, and so forth. And it was the large multinationals and so forth that actually couldn't deal with some of the gaps. And yet some of the small localized food producers were actually able to manage, some of the ways of food distribution. So I think there's going to be different flow-on effects. And just like Alyssa said, compounding, and not all communities are going to recover at the same time. So.
And also, I think to add to that, clearly we all know that there's going to be more frequency of events, more intense events and so on. We know that, but we haven't got long. 2040 sounds, a few years away, but it's really a minute. And so I think one of the things we need to consider is how are we going to be dealing with responding to those events? Because it seems as though at the moment, we're lacking a whole lot of things in terms of our response and how we can rally people and mobilise people and capitalise on what already exists rather than necessarily reinventing a wheel. I think there's not enough focus on what's already out there and how we can capitalise on it. And I'm not talking about the practical responders who are already out there doing it 24/7, 365 days a year, facing all kinds of different emergencies. I'm thinking of the communities who already have knowledge, who have skills, who have experience, but it's not there's no collaboration between the communities and the emergency services. So when we talk about silos, one of the things is, of course, and this comes up in every single emergency, every single after action review, every single Royal Commission, is that things are working in silos and they're not working together. So I think one of the big things that we need to aim for, and I think it came out in the pandemic as well, is how we are going to work together as communities, discover what we can do, and then be able to implement that really effectively to deal with emergencies.
I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I think thinking about 2040, I also thought back to 1940. And, so 2040 will be kind of approaching the centenary since the sort of post-World War II boom and a lot of infrastructure that was built in that particular point in time. So I think we can probably imagine some of the natural disasters or even pandemics, but there could also be a kind of human-built crisis coming up in terms of pipes breaking or dams collapsing or those sorts of physical pieces of big civil infrastructure that could actually have quite huge ramifications. I'm from Urbanism. We've got a dam just outside of us and there's some pretty scary reports. But if that thing goes, so does my town.
Well, that's a really great, interesting and different perspective. But I think, so what we've heard is that there's going to be many and compounding different events. And I think one thing that I would like, the next question is really about an example of a disaster resilience or recovery effort or project that you've been involved in. And I know, Jen, you've been part of the Refuge project at the Arts Centre for some time. And that one did go through, I mean, you'll explain it much more eloquently than me, but it did go through a number of different types of disasters. And so perhaps if you could introduce everyone to that project, but also what you found almost testing these different kinds of disasters and whether there's actually a lot of similarities, even though the actual disaster is quite different. I'd be interested to hear about that too.
Sure, and both Alyssa and Faye have been involved as partners in Refuge as well, so that's how we know each other. But so Refuge started in 2016. It's at Arts House, which is the City of Melbourne's major performance venue. And at that time, it was a group of artists that were wondering about, crossing the threshold of no longer talking about climate change or raising awareness to climate change. It was actually, for lack of a better term, shit's going to happen. What are we going to do about it? And at that time, Arts House's production team realized that North Melbourne Town Hall was actually a designated relief centre if North Melbourne flooded. So the idea was that we were just going to rehearse what would happen in that scenario. And it was a 24-hour scenario of converting Arts House into a disaster relief centre with a flood scenario. And then in 2017, we did a heat wave and started working with regional partners. In 2018, we worked with the Peter Doherty Institute to rehearse a pandemic. 2019, there's lots of material online about our rehearsal. Yeah, very prescient work. And 2019 and 2020, we were really looking at climate-related displacement. And now we were supposed to finish in 5 years, but now we're in our 7th year. But what's happened with Refuge is that working with, it brings disaster risk reduction and resilience with the climate emergency context in arts and culture. And it's in that nexus, in that sweet spot in the middle that we are able to play. We have a dramatological methodology that we call playing in the dark, right? This is where we allow risk, where we can explore risk, where our partners can't explore risk, and we can engage the discipline of the imaginary. Whereas a lot of our partners, they talk about how they can't engage the public imaginary when it comes to exploring certain disaster scenarios. So this, with working with the artists, I think in our first year, we had 600 to 800 people come through in the 24 hours, where when emergency services do drills, they don't see those numbers. So we're engaging communities with their hearts and the mind. But one of the major outcomes of this is that this year, the City of Melbourne invited 3 of us to come and co-design and co-facilitate their hypothetical. So that was just so now we're working, it was all about getting everyone's legs under the same table, but now we're actually all working together.
Incredible. Alyssa, could you tell us more about that program with City of Melbourne?
Yeah, I think Shannon was such a fantastic outcome of the Refuge program, in that it started to really shift to how we might embed some of the learnings and the processes into our current practices at City of Melbourne. So there's, emergency management exercises that happen, for all kinds of authorities. Every local government does them. But the really fantastic thing about the one this year was really involving artists and community as part of that process. So not a bunch of authorities in uniforms sitting around the table deciding what would happen at the point of a disaster. It was a conversation with a lot of different perspectives. I think half of the tables were residents from the local area, and a real mix of residents as well, and bringing the perspective of art in there to really get that creative thinking. Complex problems require a lot of people thinking about how we might address them. It needs that collective action, and sometimes actually taking yourself into a more creative space can really open up what possibilities there might be to problems that we don't have solutions to. So I think it was a really fantastic exercise in kind of lifting it above a very structured, top-down or authority-led process to really bringing community voice and very diverse community voice, and really bringing that creative perspective as well.
Incredible.
Could I just share a little bit of a story of a project I was involved in some years ago, where I went to Peru as part of a research award I was granted to study earthquake and tsunami response in Peru. Well, they have 400 earthquakes a year, so they're quite used to having to respond to earthquakes. But the really critical factor is that they respond as whole of communities. And this is something I think that we can learn from, and we're not really sort of considering at the moment. And the exercising is also a critical factor, because when we look at the emergency services, just from my perspective as a responder, what you find is often people at the sort of higher echelons of management in the emergency services will participate in exercises. Many of the exercises are desktop, so it's very theoretical. They're not actually out there on the front line. They're the managers. So they don't really know what it's like to be the person and the stress of responding and the trauma of responding. But they're good at management. But a lot of the desktop exercises don't give them a feel for what's actually going to happen in the real world either, because it's much more dramatic than what happens in a desktop exercise. So in Peru, what I also went to study, apart from the sort of tactical response stuff, was the community, because they have 4 times a year whole of community response exercises. Everybody's involved all at the same time. So for example, in the capital city of Lima, there are 11 million people, and at whatever the date was, the 29th of May at 11 a.m, when the tsunami and the earthquake hit, the whole city stops and everyone goes through their response activities. Now, they are not all highly trained first responders. They are community people, some of whom have some first aid training, most of whom know about how to evacuate out of their buildings. But what they have, when Jen talks about systems, is this terrific network, which is that anywhere there's a group of people is a neighbourhood, for example. So if you're in a tower block, you're a neighbourhood. If you're in a school, you're in a group or a neighbourhood. If you're in a suburb, you know, lots of people all together, you're a neighbourhood. If you're a business district, that's another neighbourhood. And each one of those neighbourhoods rehearse who's the first aider, who can help carry things, who might have some equipment, how do we get out, where do we meet, and how do we make sure we've got everyone. So it's very, very simple what they have to do, but they all know how to do that. So when the exercise is done 4 times a year, they all go about doing all of that. They all account for each other. They look out for each other. They help the more vulnerable. And meantime, the trained emergency services are focused on dealing with the actual physical response to the incident that may have occurred. So it's really efficient because it gets everybody doing small things that contribute to a larger effort, but it's also incredible in terms of social cohesion because everyone's working together and everyone's thinking about how they can help each other. So it's a fantastic project, but it goes back to rehearsing or doing exercising. And perhaps later on I might raise a point also about, you know, how we do this. And we think about children and schools. Children play, pretend all the time. They don't see any barriers to thinking the most fantastical scenarios possible. But when we grow up, we think that's maybe a little bit too far-fetched and we lose that ability to freely imagine. And I think that's also where institutions, managers, bureaucrats and so forth they've lost that power to imagine.
Incredible. So the big theme of those 3 is really the role of making sure a diverse section of the community is part of these conversations, and not only part of preparing for a disaster, but also being well prepared to actually respond to it when it happens, so that, as you can say, those other professional responders can get on and actually deal with that element of it. So I know, Andrew, you have quite almost a different perspective to the rest of the panel, given that you were working in the city of Christchurch a number of years subsequent to the earthquakes that have happened there. But I'd be interested in your reflections on being there in Christchurch and how your involvement in trying to think about how you respond after an event.
Yeah, so Christchurch, to use their own word, was pretty munted. The earthquakes, there was multiple in 2010, 2011, really did some damage both to the physical infrastructure of that city and also some of the social elements as well. I think the interesting, so I turned up sort of 5 years after the earthquake, by which point most of the sort of big strategic plans had been done. They called it the blueprint, all the kind of probably the first response emergency works, fixing pipes, all those sorts of things had been done. But the city was probably moving into that phase where it's, okay, how do we start to build this city back and build it back better? How do you actually make decisions on development applications? How do you actually make sure that buildings are built for different sets of earthquake strengthening rules? How do you retrofit buildings? How do you start to kind of really think about things in a slightly different way and then implement it? So as a kind of urban designer working within the council, probably a third of my role was dealing with resource consent, so planning applications. And dealing with this kind of balance of wanting to build back better. As built environment professionals, we can see where we want to get to, but you're also dealing with a city that has a relatively fragile economy. So there was also a perception that council would say yes to everything and never say no to a development, because any development's good development, and having even a substandard or a mediocre building is better than a gravel car park, as most of the city became a gravel car park sort of as people land bank, and you're kind of wanting to not land bank, but then you're also wanting good buildings to happen. So it's a really interesting kind of time to be there. I found it quite, as an individual kind of professional working in that space, some days you'd walk down the street and you'd see a new public space being created and you're like absolutely filled with joy. And then you turn the corner and you see big gaps and you're kind of filled with dread as well. So it's almost bipolar in the sense of how you live and work in that space.
So I think what's interesting about these examples that we've heard today is that 3 of them are much more about the systems to actually prepare for a disaster, and one of them is about what to do afterwards. I heard this great statistic from Melissa that actually 97% of all funds are actually directed to cleaning up after a disaster rather than preparing for it. And so I'd be interested to hear from each of you. Obviously, there's a lot of benefit that comes out of actually being prepared in advance. How can we shift that mindset? Perhaps, Alyssa, you look like you keen to say something.
Yeah, it's a really awful statistic, but a real one, Kath, about that's our national spend. So in Australia, at the moment, 97% of our national funds for disasters go to cleaning up afterwards. We only invest 3% at the moment in mitigation, resilience, adaptation, preparing for those disasters. It's not sustainable. It's not a good way to do things, and we need to shift it. And I think it is shifting, even at a national level. We've seen a lot more funding come out recently that's about preparing communities, that's acknowledging the role of locally led efforts, not just kind of one size fits all. And it's really heartening to see that shift. I think it's also a shift in our mindsets. We know that we're going to experience more impacts of climate change. We know we're going to experience more types of disasters, and they're not just, they're not just climate change disasters. It's also social disasters, things like terrorism incidents. There's a whole confluence of things that we need to deal with, and we need to be better prepared. It's not the responsibility of SES or, ambulance Vic or fire or the army. Often the first responders, which just means the first people there after something happens, will be us. We need to really, I think, get that in our heads that we all have a role to play here in the future of our cities and what's going to happen. Yeah, I guess that's the first thing for me, just acknowledging that we all have a role to play in ensuring that we are resilient to disasters, and switching this mindset that it's just something that gets mopped up afterwards, or it's something that the authorities will come to fix. I'm an optimist. There's lots and lots of things that we can do around building resilience. But yeah, I think that's probably the first step.
Okay. I think Faye, it was interesting, your example from Peru, where we did have community members involved 4 times a year in kind of acting out these elements and kind of making that connection to each other and preparing for it. I was interested that I have a few friends that live in the Northern Rivers area, and a number of them were becoming volunteers with SES. I'd be interested in perhaps, whether everyone here should be joining SES, or are there other avenues for people to do exactly what Melissa's saying in terms of acknowledging that everyone here would be the first responder?
Yes, there's a challenge here. Well, in a way, yes, everyone should join an emergency service, then we'd have lots of people doing the work. So another statistic is that in Australia, between 87 and 90%, between 87 and 90 of emergency and disaster response work is done by volunteers. So never mind the army and everything else, the work is done by volunteers. The workforce is volunteers. And I think a lot of people don't realise that. It's not necessarily publicised. And the managers, you know, the bureaucracy that look after those volunteers, the paid staff, are very small in number. So, for example, in the SES in Victoria, there are 5,000 volunteers across the state in every different municipality or region, and there are 198 paid people who are public servants managing it at the top, as an example. But I believe the agencies have to change what they're doing about how they're recruiting people and what they're asking them to do, because the beauty of the Peruvian system is that it's manageable, it's achievable, everybody does just a little bit and they all know what they're doing. But if you want to join the SES or the CFA or the, you know, DELP or the RFS or any of the agencies, suddenly you find you've committed your life to it. It's enormous amount of work and training involved. Every one of the agencies is an RTO registered training organisation. We all work to the national quality frameworks. We gain professional qualifications. Everybody has to train one night a week, 360, 52 weeks a year. We then have to do weekend courses. We have to practice all the time. At the same time, we're available to go out to respond, and there's response, every single week of the year. There's never a time when there's no response and no emergency or incident happens. There's never a time. It's not only those big, large, enormous events. It's all the little events that happen every single week. And in Melbourne as well, in the city, it's full of nature strips with trees or people's gardens with trees. There's always a tree falling over somewhere, even if you can't hear it. So the amount of training is very onerous. And then there's paperwork. There's a whole lot of administration that goes with it. You have to upskill yourself constantly because they keep changing all the sort of standards. So you might have done one qualification 8 years ago and now you've got to redo it all over again. So what you find is it's an enormous drain on people's time. They need their family to support them, otherwise you just couldn't do it. Often it's also means that there's barriers to women coming into the emergency services because often they are the ones who, whether we like it or not, there's still a sense that it's easier for men to go out one night a week and go to training while the women might look after the kids, but not the reverse. So there's a lot of barriers to women entering into the services, and the services have an abysmal proportion of women in the emergency services. The fire services are struggling to make double digits. SES is a little bit better. We're up to about 32% in some areas, but not in others. So there's a whole range of factors which are too difficult for a lot of people to join the emergency services and be what is essentially professionally trained. So looking at something that's simpler and that's more achievable is something that I think the agencies have not yet come to grips with. They haven't considered that because it's always been this way, right? We've always done it like this, so we just keep doing it like that. And it's very hard to shift people's thinking and conceptualisation of what response might look like.
I'd be interested. I know, Alyssa, you work at local government and you have previously worked at other local governments. With Faye's framing around the idea of the different neighbourhoods in Peru, each like having a role, do you think local government could be setting up similar processes? Perhaps it's not the emergency services that need to be setting these up.
Yeah, definitely. I think we know there's a fair bit of research on communities that have really good social capital and social cohesion recover much faster after disasters. Daniel Aldridge has written a lot on this if you're really interested in it. So one of the best things that we can do to build resilience is for people to know their neighbours and to know each other and to look out for each other in their community. Disasters and vulnerabilities to disasters are different in every place. So every neighbourhood will have a different set of types of disasters and types of vulnerabilities to those disasters. And they'll also have different strengths. So one of the projects we're working on at City of Melbourne is to actually map that. We're starting with one of our neighbourhoods right now, and we'll scale it up for all 11 of our neighbourhoods, using data as a start. So actually understanding what what are some of the climate change or disaster impacts for Kensington. It'll be a little bit different from, say, Kensington to other more flood-prone areas like Macaulay. The vulnerabilities will be very different. If you look at Carlton, the demographics are quite different in terms of students and public housing from what they might be in areas like the CBD, with a lot of people living in high-rise. And what are the strengths or the capacities of that community? What are the trusted places that they would go to? What are the networks they have, the organisations that they can draw on? And putting all of that together so that we have a better picture of what are the types of disasters, impacts and ways that we might respond. So it's some mapping we're doing at City of Melbourne, but actually the most important part of that is about building the capacity of those communities and those services in a way that they identify for how they would like to build their own resilience and respond.
Thank you. I'd be interested, Jen, in your work with the arts and culture, like what role can that play in terms of building this community resilience, but also that preparedness? And also, after a kind of extreme event, what's the role of art and culture there as well?
I think I can address a couple of the points that have come across here as a case study. So I'm a professional artist. I was doing a lot of work pre-COVID in America, and in the middle of March, all my work was basically axed. And we were living in Faulkner, which is the most northern suburb of Moreland, and I just finished doing the Food Hub feasibility study, mapping the north of Moreland. There was this moment where my partner had started a community garden because there were no social spaces in Faulkner. Largely, the demographic is between, I think the largest groups are under 11 and over 80, right? English is the 5th dominant language. 24% of the population doesn't have internet, right? So we're sitting there, and I said to my partner, how are you going to harvest the veggies in the community garden? And she said, no, we won't be able to. We can't have volunteers. And I was going, this is going to be a heavily impacted community. We've rehearsed a pandemic. I've looked at the food security. I think we need to get on the front foot here. Within a week or so, every single food relief organization in the north of Moreland closed. I got a whole group of people together. I'm like, I know how to do choreography. I know how to, do productions, and that's how I use that skill set, and got 14 different people together. I called council because of Arts House and North Melbourne. I thought it was a thing that all councils would give up their asset to a community in a disaster response. So I just called Moreland and said, can we have your bowling club to mobilize a food hub, just so that we could have a constant food supply. And then what happened was, within a week, we had people coming up to the door asking for food. And then it snowballed. And there was nothing coming up. We were getting the leftovers of food, food that wasn't culturally relevant. It wasn't fresh. It was old. It was moldy. It was completely undignified to give people that food, especially large families and so forth. And there was nobody coming up there. So Gregory Lorenzuti, a contemporary dancer and photographer, also didn't have work. But we got a basic income because we both qualified for JobKeeper. And so Gregory transformed that community garden into an urban farm. So if you ever want to go for a little trip up Sydney Road, it's called Faulkner Food Bowls. And we created Faulkner Commons, and for 2 years we ran it as a food distribution hub. It wasn't about food, we created pay-as-you-go things. We didn't do food relief. We were about transforming people from food relief to food justice. In terms of demographics, we had over 60 volunteers. There was only one that was a cisgendered white male between the age of 18 and 35. Okay. We would have Mohammed praying on one side of the pool table while one of our transgender volunteers was teaching one of the women in her 70s what pronouns were. It was an incredible sort of response. But what the things that we prioritized was inclusion, social cohesion, and that nobody was to feel desperate.
Incredible. And so is there any lessons from that in terms of how we can privilege these different voices, in terms of how we think about disaster recovery? Because I think what we've heard is that often it's these kind of emergency services elements that are predominantly white and male and perhaps a bit older as well. How do we make sure those diverse voices are involved?
I can speak to that because just like it was Margaret Atwood that actually coined that we're living in everything changed in 2018. But we're living in experimental times. Essentially, we don't have the luxury of time to come up with, complex systems, just like we were saying there, but not reinventing the wheel. So with all of our volunteers, when people showed up, we had, what do you have? What can you offer? What do you need? Those were our 3 questions. And then it was like, we've never done this before. So this is how we're operating. Like, what's your skill set? What's your time availability? And people just started filling in those pieces. And then by the end of the 2 years, I actually didn't know how to operate it. Like, it just became a system unto itself. And it became like a heartbeat for quite some time. And now that we've stopped Faulkner Commons, but 2 of our volunteers have gone on to start the Mary Food Hub.
Incredible. That's great. So we've heard about, community infrastructure that's being created through these projects, and also that there is some physical infrastructure, being the Bowls Club, that have helped enable that. I'd be interested, Andrew, if we're going to kind of extend out that 3% of money that's spent on preparing for these things, what is the physical infrastructure in our cities that's going to support that? Is it about universities giving over space? Is it about local councils giving over space? Is it about greening our streets so that we don't have to suffer from urban heat island effect as much? Like, what's the physical infrastructure that we need?
It comes back to public assets, civic spaces and public spaces. In times of disaster, I guess, or in those immediate aftermaths, you do coalesce around public space that everybody can feel comfortable in, and there's no sense of ownership or, are we allowed here, those sorts of things. So I think, and this goes, another little point I want to bring up as well about some of these conversations is, this Festival of Urbanism, there's lots of urban planners, there's lots of urban designers in the room, and it's in our name. We plan, we design. So whilst we might not be the best at necessarily doing disaster planning or thinking, we can actually think about our physical spaces and what they need to be or where they need to get at. I think one of the interesting things in Christchurch is that city had issues before the earthquake. So Jan Gall actually went out there a year before the first earthquake and was sort of working with them to try and improve their laneways and do some of the work that he did here in Melbourne, take some of those lessons over there. And they prepared a kind of a city centre strategy that was incredibly ambitious. They had no idea how they were going to actually achieve it. It was sort of a 20, 30-year vision. And then all of a sudden, after the earthquake, it actually became the opportunity to deliver on those strategies that they already had in place. So I think for the planners and the designers in the room, my call to you tonight is be ambitious with some of those strategies and plans. Think down the track, because you might actually get an opportunity to implement things that you've never thought you could.
As a fellow urban planner, I just want to add to that. And I'm lucky enough at City of Melbourne, my role kind of bridges both the community side of resilience as well as the planning side. But I know that with Urban Design Forum, there's lots of architects, urban designers, landscape architects in the room. There is absolutely a role in planning and design of our cities to make sure that we are preparing for and mitigating some of the impacts that we know are to come, not just from climate change, but also disasters. There's a really startling piece of research that came out of University of Melbourne recently that if we had a heat wave and we also at the same time had a power outage, because that is absolutely possible, 80% of our apartments would literally bake. They would exceed the international health standards for what is appropriate for someone's health and well-being. And that's a very real possibility. And there are some people that are particularly more vulnerable to that. that than others. So we need to stop designing in a way that doesn't consider the things that we know are coming. We can design really great buildings that have better thermal protection, that don't put people in those situations. They're also just really great then for health and well-being every day that we live in them. We need to stop planning in floodplains, or if we're going to put people in floodplains, people and buildings, we need to ensure that there are things in place in terms of design and planning to mitigate that. When we've had floods, we've had plenty of floods recently in Queensland and New South Wales. We need to get over thinking that we just go back to business as usual. We just build as quickly as we can. You know, this dilemma that happened in Christchurch. We need to take that opportunity from that disaster to reset how we do things and to do it better. Take that opportunity to think, how are we going to mitigate this, you know, for next year or for following years, so that we're not ending up with the same situation where people are having to throw out all of their stuff because it's flooded again, also not sustainable, and, you know, everything else that comes with that. So just a couple of, you know, examples, I think, yeah, just there are many, many things that we can do to ensure that we are designing in a good way. And just like on a very practical level, even down to the playgrounds that we build, there was a study in New South Wales, Resilience New South Wales, put it out that the playgrounds in Western Sydney on a really hot day, some of those slides were getting to like 90 degrees, 100 degrees. We're talking like really serious burns for children. So just down to the smaller scale, not just the whole building scale, but the smaller scale of how we design our cities, really thinking about how people use those, how that intersects with the challenges that we have ahead, and how we can do it better.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's an incredible call to arms to everyone in the room. And I think it's a good segue to my next and final question for the panel before we open up to questions. So do think about your questions. If you had a magic wand, and perhaps, Jen, we can start with you. If you had a magic wand, what is one thing we should do as a society that would help improve our resilience and preparedness for disaster?
Plan for our future ancestors. I mean, we need to be prioritizing, you know, child-centered trauma prevention in the climate emergency, and in our building, in our planning, in our education, all across the board, not the one size fits all that we plan for right now.
My wish would be that we integrate all kinds of ideas about emergencies, disasters in schools, in education from day one, from when they start. That it's something that's seen as part of our normal existence. We have, for example, in Victoria, some of the worst bushfires in the world. We're prone to the worst rates of flooding in some of the places, and yet we seem to be a little bit complacent sometimes and think, oh, well, yes, it's happened, but it's not going to happen again now for another 10 years, so I'll be all right for a while. We need to just integrate it into ourselves and how we think about our daily lives. And it's not only the big emergencies, it's also for the small ones. And even things like AV have a program of Good Sam, for example. I don't know if people know that, where if you've already got a qualification in CPR, it can come up on your phone if someone's needing help, and you might get there first before the ambulance and be able to take some action. There's all these little things that can be done in communities, but we need to educate people. So for me, it's education.
Andrew?
Magic wand. I'd probably disrupt the property market. Hear me out. It's, you know, I think, and it goes back to some of that volunteering thing too. I've probably been someone who hasn't volunteered, in part because I've been bouncing around rentals and never ever felt part of a community. I think we've also got a scenario where it comes back to some of the housing standards that we're building, where, you know, we're building houses for investment rather than for people to live in, and we're not necessarily building communities for people to be a community. So yeah, if I had a magic wand, maybe I'd disrupt the property market and let people be communities again.
Oh, so many things. One, my mind's ticking over. I'm going to go with a really simple one, but I think knowing your neighbour. Like if everyone just actually knew who their neighbours were and we looked out for each other, regardless of what is to come our way, I have every faith that with the many, many skills and kindness that we all have, we'd be able to solve whatever's in front of us.
Thanks, Alyssa. So who's up first? Who has a question?
Hi, can you hear me? Pamela, I have a question. When we have new buildings or new precincts, how can we create a community resilience plan? Like what would be the process? Who would be the best person to create it, or who do we need to contact? Things like that.
You can start. Do you want to start?
I'm not actually sure. I'm going to take a slight little detour. I think one of the little lessons that I learned out of Christchurch is that sometimes it's not the local authority and it's not their job to do everything. I think one of the great things that happened out of Christchurch was a whole bunch of kind of these really quirky, interesting community groups that got established that then were kind of like secretly funded by council, but council kind of had the confidence to step back and let them do it. I'm thinking of Life in Vacant Spaces, Greening the Rubble, and Gap Filler, of great names and great little community groups. So to answer the question, hopefully there's some good, maybe not council groups out there that could help you.
I would support that. I think if you come together, you probably find once you get a group of people together, they've got the answers. And they might just need a few little hints from some of the inverted commas, experts. But there's probably many, many things that small groups will figure out for themselves about what they need and what they need to do. So I think there's no kind of science behind it. I think once people get together and start talking, they'll work it out.
I'm going to come from a different angle. Centre food. Food is the one thing that brings people together. And in times of crisis, it's the thing that can rip us apart. So it's a very simple thing, have people over for dinner. And I also use the metaphor often of passata making, right? Like if everybody goes and makes their own batch of passata, a lot of energy goes out, buying the equipment, growing the tomatoes, the water, the energy, to make the passata. But there's probably one person in the neighborhood that grows really great tomatoes, right? And then there's one person, who likes to run the machines, and there are people who can lift the big kettles and stuff like that. So make it a community effort, and it's really easy to do that around food.
I'm going to add a different perspective, because I think if we're talking about new precincts, there is a role for local government or new neighbourhoods, and that is providing some of the kind of structure that might help to enable communities to come together in a way that they see best. Reflecting on some of the flooding that happened up north, and of course communities will absolutely find a way to come together at a point of emergency, but actually setting up some of those ways that can happen beforehand can be really, really helpful for community and authorities to kind of come together in a collaborative way. So it might be about knowing who the community leaders are, knowing about ways that they like to have communication out through their communities, and setting up really simple, even online structures for people to be able to collaborate or to offer help or to give help, those types of things beforehand. So yeah, I do think that there's a role for local government to play in terms of that resilience planning, particularly with new neighbourhoods and precincts, but doing it with community in a way that they can see is a really good way to support them in resilience at the point of disaster.
Can I just add something? But also pay them, right? Pay them. If you want that expertise in the room, pay them, because what this hands-off approach with councils to work with community leaders get piled on, and just piled on and piled on. So it's really important to honor their time and what they're doing in terms of that labor. So if you want the diversity of perspectives, they need to be remunerated for their time.
Oh, we have some online questions. I'll take one online and then back to you.
So this is a question from an anonymous attendee online. What seems to be a considerable and frequent oversight in discussions of this nature is the increased risk of conflict-related disaster and impacts on critical infrastructures. So the question for the panel is, how can a more strategic national level conversation be started that begins to sketch out security and conflict-related urban threats that Australia is increasingly facing? One might think, for example, of unfolding government decisions around nuclear submarine basing that increases the risk of Australian cities and communities to long-range strike.
Bit above my pay grade. But there's certainly legitimate concern there for if we're talking about things that are, I suppose, more in the realm of defence. So if we're talking about things to do with nuclear submarines and those sorts of things, and how that is reflected through to the community. Now, the community, of course, has a voice. So one of the other things that I suppose is sort of deteriorating in recent years or decades is people's being engaged in a political process and feeling that they have agency in a political process. So a lot of those things will be happening if people do not come together and raise their voice or raise objections. And I think it's up to each one of us to make sure we are engaged politically in order to secure the best outcomes for our community. You know, that's all that we can do. We're not working for the Defence Department. I'm not in charge of, you know, all the response. That's all that we can do. But it's really critical that we do that because, you know, that has sort of tended to take a back seat in recent years and people aren't as engaged as what they might be. But if we want our communities to be safe and secure, we need to lobby, we need to advocate, we need to express our opinions, we need to get together and form a bigger group. So even if we get back to simpler things, apart from, you know, different, very serious possible potential risks, but what about the regulations around building cladding? You know, the La Crosse Tower fire in Docklands and London, of course, and other buildings around the world. And we've still got hundreds and hundreds of buildings in Australia with flammable cladding. What about regulation around that and lobbying for that and advocating to make sure that the regulators are also taking the community's interest as front of mind? So there's things, you know, those kinds of things to do with building materials.
It attacked a part of the community in Christchurch that was actually quite small, and it was really interesting, and particularly around food. I remember getting a message the evening of the attack being like, does anyone know how to make 1,000 halal meals? You know, can we get these ingredients? How can you pull that together? Because the community was quite small, so small that they needed kind of outside help to help them that night as well. And Christchurch, which was typically an incredibly white British kind of city, in part after the earthquakes, has really diversified and has, I think, and even that event has probably then further elevated them and kind of built up a whole bunch of capacity, even how to kind of talk about minorities and work with different parts of the community and to work together. And even I'm just thinking, you know, the city of Christchurch, its physical city now is much better than it was even a few years ago. Like, it's improving year on year. It's a plug here to go visit it. You know, the cultural narrative that's now been tangibly embedded in some of those public spaces and public buildings is absolutely phenomenal. So conflict sucks. But I think we as humans kind of get through it as well and hopefully come out of it better at the other end.
I just finished reading Adam Kahane's Collaborating with the Enemy. And the premise of that book is actually to be able to hold conflict, right, and to cultivate dissensus, because the complexity of the times means that we're not going to all be able to agree on different things. So it's about how do we find common objectives in terms of working together, but also holding the fact that we might not agree on different things as well. So great book, by the way.
Thanks for fantastic discussions so far. I
not between two questions. I guess reflecting on the fact that, you know, the comment you've made around how 90% of funding is actually goes to recovery. I guess just thinking about, like, if the disasters themselves aren't enough to shift us from business as usual, what is?
Insurance companies. You know, I think we're starting to see that at the moment, where actually things are becoming uninsurable, and that's really it's kind of a very capitalist approach to it. But it's kind of saying, actually, we need to fund. You know, I think we're hitting that point where the cost of rebuilding now is far greater than the cost of cleanup. Or it's getting to the point where we're able to calculate it, and so I think that's a bit of a watch this space that I'm kind of keenly watching, because you know, I think in the past that was that kind of hashtag we will rebuild, but with Lismore, it's probably the first time I've really seen some harsh critique of the planning profession, and actually, you know, do we move the town? Do we actually look at this and make some big moves in order to not have it repeat?
That's interesting, because that sort of came up after the bushfires. Sorry, I was just going to say that came up after the Black Saturday bushfires. But I think it was quite obviously a very difficult conversation. But I don't know whether it sustained or it just sort of we went back to business. I think we went back to business as usual to a great degree.
I think that I think we need to think about individuals as well as government, for example. So a lot of the things that people have been rebuilding after the fires, it's been up to an individual family or a person to work out, you know, fire-safe ways of building homes back where they were. Lismore, you know, people get individual grants, they might get bought out, but it's on an individual basis. But the governments and authorities have known for decades, you know, or forever, that building on the floodplains means that you're going to get flooded. And so shifting whole communities it shouldn't be about an individual approach of like, we'll pay you something or we'll buy you out or you'll take this. It's got to be a really strong community-centred approach to move the community, and that is not just the infrastructure, that's looking at the social infrastructure that goes with it. So the whole of community needs to be moved, and that means the authorities have to think about what it is that makes that community that particular place. So apart from physically shifting it up to higher ground, it also, you can't just sort of shift people and say, okay, there's your new house, off you go. There has to be a whole lot of other things that have already been existing in that community, and that needs to go with them.
I just gave a keynote at the National Summit on Disaster Risk and Resilience, and the federal government is investing. That 3% is changing. It's just watch that space, because I have been really advocating for years to get legs at the table in terms of arts and culture, First Nations voices and young people. And in 2019, in between the pandemic and the bushfires, there was a summit that was at Melbourne Town Hall, and that representation meant one person sitting on a chair and got about 3 minutes to speak at each one. This time, Tyson Yanka-Porter was called up to do a keynote. I was called up, and then another young climate activist, and as keynotes. And what came out of those discussions over those 2 days is that a lot of the decision makers realize that they actually need those voices. They just don't know how to engage. And the thing is that those voices don't do community engagement in that sort of conventional way. And so, but at least they're listening and they're doing a new action plan. So, you know, watch that space. There should be money coming this way for preparedness.
I think disasters do create opportunities to do things differently. And I think we've seen that with the pandemic. Our definition for resilience at City of Melbourne, we just changed in the last year or so to reflect that. It's not just about adapting, surviving and thriving to different types of shocks and stresses. It is also about transforming from those experiences because of the opportunity that disruption or disaster creates. We've seen some amazing positive things come out of the pandemic alongside all of the difficult things. And that has come both from, all of us, as well as from, kind of a top-down or authority-led approach. I hope that we see, some shifts in the way that we work to more flexible working that has really supported a lot of people in terms of how they work in the workplace. It's shifting the way that we live in our neighbourhoods. It's made us less CBD-centric. It's made us question what the role of the CBD is. It's helped us to experiment a lot more. We've seen all kinds of different experiments happen in our cities all around the world since the pandemic as a way to try and respond to what we're dealing with. So I have a lot of faith in using the opportunity of disaster. I think if we could take that mindset with us, for any disruption that comes, small or large, to look at how you might change your business as usual, to take that opportunity to experiment, to trial, to do things differently, to bring in diverse voices as part of that and diverse ideas, and hopefully move forward into a better future than we had before the disaster occurred.
And one last question. It's like Andy's at the ready.
Thank you. I'm really interested in the conversation around the sort of proportion of who's responding. Some of those stats are extraordinary. As sort of first people on site, had a number of friends involved in Lismore who were directing ADF personnel who didn't know where to go. Koori Radio was the sort of organising epicenter. It's quite extraordinary. Is there going to be a need for something more society-wide, like a reservist kind of approach, rather than these groups of 5,000 people? Is it likely that we'll see a much broader need for training across society, whether that happens at high school or whatever? And are there good examples of that internationally that you could draw upon?
I'll jump in quickly. When I signed up to be a staff member at Christchurch City Council, part of my contract had a clause in it that says, should there be an emergency, I would be seconded into the civil defence. And I would be like, well, what's this? And it's nothing, it's nothing to be scary about. But the example was like, oh yeah, we had an earthquake in Kaikoura in 2016, and the person that you're replacing, it was their job to go up there and just design how the portaloos got laid out, because they were an urban designer and they had that sort of skill set. They could do that. So, potentially, I mean, that's in the civil service, whether it's something a bit more broader, but that's an example in New Zealand.
That's also an idea that's being considered in Victoria at the moment as well, in the public service. So I think there's ideas being floated about changing the approach. So whether how effective that will be, because again, the rigorous training that's involved in order to be a qualified first responder is huge. But as we all know, and it's come out from the review in New South Wales as well, that it was with the local people who brought out their tinnies and their inflatable boats and their pool rings and whatever it might have been, to help save other people in their community, even when they were told, don't go and do it, by the emergency services. And they still went and did it. Good on them, because they've saved lives. So I think it's that coming together of people on the ground and understanding communities, but communities know each other. When we're talking about the same sorts of things as the City of Melbourne, one of the things that I did in Refuge Project was a thing called a street plan, so that your local community or your neighbourhood, whatever is your street. So as we're talking about knowing your neighbour and knowing who's got an inflatable rubber boat, who's got skills, who's got the tools, who's got their boat licence, who might have conducted these kinds of activities before, who's out there on the waters all the time. If you know that, you can mobilise much more quickly. And then there's people, which is also what happened in New South Wales, who were straight onto Facebook and straight onto organising all those groups, and they had those skills. So all we need to do, we need to put all those things together and make that jigsaw into the one big picture, but it's so that the big challenge is in coordination of all of those things. Not that those things aren't there, they are, and there's people who can do those jobs, and there's the fully trained professional emergency responders as well. but it's to do with coordination. The coordination requires a little bit more vision than what we've had so far, because we've had models that are all siloed, but now we need a little bit more vision about putting it all together. There is, of course, there's other projects that are going on, like the Minderoo Foundation is setting up a Australian Resilience Corps that is for recovery, for after the fact, not necessarily for emergency response, but there's certainly lots of other things that are happening at the moment where people obviously have gone, well, we've got to do a bit more. How can we do it? How can we make it work more effectively? There's things happening.
There's irony in that, in the Minderoo Foundation, because it's funded by Twiggy Forrest. You know, a little bit of disaster capitalism there, I think. But I think one other thing to just sort of draw attention to again is around where we source information. Like, a lot of people that come to Australia from refugee and migrant backgrounds have actually experienced some of the things that we will be experiencing in the future and have a lot of knowledge around that. Like when we did disaster shelter building with First Nations Master Weavers, and there was a woman there who ran a refugee center for 12 years, and she just came there as a refugee, and then basically ended up running the whole thing for 12 years. And we were just going, you know, there is a lot of knowledge that is overlooked, undervalued, that we are not engaging with. And so I think as an action to everybody here, like, I mean, just say hello to your neighbor, find out what their skills and their knowledges are and so forth, because they might be the missing piece in a disaster.
Probably the only thing I have to add to that is that the complexity of the problems we face are going to take multiple solutions, multiple people involved. And so, yeah, Andy, while something like that will be absolutely amazing, and I hope we could get it going in Australia and it could be funded with that shift of funding more so into preparing and supporting people and actually paying them for those roles. Yeah, I think there's been a number of other things mentioned on the panel tonight about, you know, the amazing skill sets that we have, you know, just here in this room or with the people in your building or your community. How do we kind of build these multiple levels of ways that we are more resilient to the things that can come? And I think that that's going to require, yeah, a shift of all of our efforts from, you know, very kind of top-led approaches with government all the way through to the way that we think about it, you know, as a community and support each other regardless of what we are to face.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the questions tonight. So we've heard a range of different perspectives, but there's been some really, really clear messages coming through. So I think the first is that the time is now. We can't be waiting until there is a disaster and trying to respond to it. We need to be thinking about how we can build our community resilience together and really put that effort and that emphasis into that preparedness. And the other element that has come through just incredibly powerfully is that it's not about some other that's going to be dealing with it. It's everyone in this room that needs to be engaged with this conversation. So, you know, finding out who your neighbours are, involving those different perspectives that have incredible wealth of knowledge on these topics, and, you know, joining together around food, having that ability to kind of really reconceptualize what it is to be a community member and your role in it, whether it is volunteering or being paid as well for that role. So thank you for that incredible conversation. And I'd also like to thank Monash University and the Festival for Future Urbanism for putting this talk on, to thank Urban Design Forum for hosting this as well. I'd like to thank Siteworks, where we're joined today, and perhaps a good venue for your community meeting that you might like to have. And finally, I'd love you all to join me in thanking these incredible panellists that have really enriched our talk tonight.